What I'm about to tell you cost one man his entire career, destroyed a billion-dollar company, and changed my life forever. And the beautiful part? I didn't have to do a single thing except step back and watch it all burn. This is the story of how incompetence, arrogance, and a cheap suit brought down an empire, and how sometimes the best revenge is simply letting gravity do its work. You know that feeling right before disaster strikes? That eerie silence when the air gets heavy and everything goes still? That's exactly what the conference room felt like on that Tuesday morning. But the disaster wasn't a storm. It was a man in a navy suit 2 sizes too small, wearing loafers with no socks and carrying enough unearned confidence to sink the Titanic. My name doesn't matter for this story, but what I did matters. For 7 years, I was the person who fixed impossible problems at 3 in the morning. I was the one who kept a $5 billion portfolio from collapsing. I was the invisible force that made everything work, and nobody knew I existed until I disappeared. Here's what they don't teach you in business school. The most powerful person in any company isn't the one with the biggest office or the fanciest title. It's the person who actually knows how everything works. It's the person clients call directly. It's the person who has spent years building relationships while everyone else was building PowerPoint presentations. I was that person, and I was about to teach everyone a very expensive lesson about the difference between leadership and competence. Let me paint you a picture of what real corporate power looks like. It's not shouting in meetings or sending emails at midnight to prove you're working. Real power is when a client worth $5 billion annually treats you like family. Real power is knowing that if you disappeared tomorrow, the entire operation would crumble within a week. Real power is being so essential that people don't even realize you're the foundation holding everything up. That was me. I handled the crown jewel of our entire portfolio, a client so valuable that his contract alone kept our stock price climbing year after year. This client wasn't just another account number in our system. He was old school, the kind of businessman who built his empire with his own hands. He hated buzzwords. He hated slide presentations. He hated people who wasted his time with fancy talk and empty promises. What he valued was results, honesty, and someone who understood that in his world, a 4-hour delay could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. We had a rhythm together, an understanding built over 7 years of late-night phone calls, crisis management, and mutual respect. When he called, I answered. When there was a problem, I fixed it. When he needed something, it was already done. That's how you maintain a $5 billion relationship. But apparently, consistent success and record-breaking profits were boring. Our leadership decided we needed something called disruption. They wanted innovation. They wanted someone young and energetic who could bring fresh ideas and modern thinking to our traditional business. What they actually got was a walking LinkedIn post who thought charisma could replace competence. They hired a vice president of strategic growth, and from the moment he walked into that boardroom, I knew exactly how this story would end. I've seen his type before. They blow in like a hurricane, destroy everything that's actually working, collect a massive paycheck, and then move on to wreck the next company. They're corporate locusts, and they always leave devastation in their wake. This new VP walked into our all-hands meeting like he was hosting a television show. Perfect teeth, artificial tan, and the manic energy of someone who had consumed way too much caffeine. He started his speech with the kind of phrases that make competent people want to run screaming from the building. He talked about being agile. He talked about trimming the fat. He talked about disruption and synergy and reimagining our entire approach. I sat in the back, taking notes, watching this performance with the weary recognition of someone who has seen this exact movie play out a dozen times before. The plot never changes. These people come in thinking they can reinvent the wheel, not realizing that the wheel works perfectly fine and doesn't need reinventing. When his eyes landed on me during that meeting, I saw exactly what he saw. He didn't see someone who had saved the company millions of dollars. He didn't see someone who managed the most important client relationship in the entire organization. He didn't see a strategic thinker who had built an entire department from nothing. What he saw was a middle-aged woman in a blazer. He saw someone who had been there too long. He saw the past, and he wanted to build the future. The problem was, he had absolutely no idea that I wasn't just part of the company's history. I was the only thing standing between success and complete disaster. After that meeting, our CEO nervously introduced us. The handshake was weak and clammy, like gripping a dead fish. The VP looked at me with barely concealed condescension and said I'd been on my main account for a long time. 7 years, I told him. He sighed dramatically and said that's a lifetime in this industry, implying that I was some kind of fossil clinging to the past. Then he dropped the bomb. He said maybe I'd been there too long. Maybe I'd gotten complacent. Maybe I couldn't see the forest for the trees anymore. I felt my blood temperature drop, but I kept my face completely neutral. I'd learned a long time ago that showing emotion in these situations only gives them power. I tried to explain that my client valued consistency and didn't appreciate change for the sake of change. The VP actually laughed at me. He laughed like I was a child who didn't understand how the world worked. He said everyone loves change if you sell it right. Then he made his fatal mistake. He said he'd been looking at the numbers and decided we were over-servicing this client. Too many hours, too much hand-holding. He said we were leaving money on the table and that he wanted to cut our support significantly. I tried to warn him. I told him clearly that if we reduced our service level, this client would walk away. The VP waved his hand dismissively and said nobody walks away from a contract this size. That's when I knew he'd never actually built anything real in his entire career. He'd only ever managed spreadsheets and theoretical models. He had no concept that business relationships are built on trust and consistency, not contracts and legal obligations. A contract is just paper. What keeps a client loyal is knowing that when something goes wrong at 3 in the morning, someone competent will answer the phone and fix it. Take that away, and the contract becomes worthless. But I couldn't tell him that because he'd already decided I was the problem. In his mind, I was the old guard standing in the way of progress. Then came the announcement that made my stomach drop. He wanted to schedule a quarterly business review with my client for the following week, and he would be leading the presentation. Let me explain why this was insane. This particular client didn't do standard business reviews. We didn't use PowerPoint slides or fancy graphics. Our meetings were conversations between professionals who respected each other's time and intelligence. We would sit in comfortable chairs, drink black coffee, and discuss logistics trends and operational challenges. It was intimate, focused, and effective. Bringing this VP into that environment would be like bringing a circus clown to a funeral. I tried to explain this. I told him carefully that this client doesn't respond well to traditional presentations. The VP cut me off mid-sentence. He told me to book the meeting and send him my presentation deck by Friday so he could polish it. He wanted graphs, hockey stick growth projections, and what he called dazzle factor. I stood there watching him walk away, and I realized something important. He just handed me a loaded gun and asked me to point it at his own head. He thought I was too old and too set in my ways to understand modern business. He didn't realize that I was about to let him prove exactly how incompetent he really was. I went back to my desk and did something I'd been preparing for without even knowing it. I opened a private folder on my personal drive and named it The Exit. Then I sent a message to our legal department asking a hypothetical question about the enforceability of my non-compete agreement, specifically regarding clients I'd brought in before a certain company merger. The response came back quickly, and I started to see a path forward. If this VP wanted to destroy everything I'd built, I wasn't going to stop him. I was going to document every single step and make sure everyone knew exactly who was responsible when it all fell apart. The preparation meeting for the client review was worse than I could have imagined. I walked in with a concise 3-page briefing document covering the key performance indicators this client actually cared about. Delivery times, error rates, cost efficiency. Clean data, clear facts, no fluff. The VP was already there, practically vibrating with excitement in front of a giant monitor. He pulled up a PowerPoint presentation with 40 slides. 40 slides for a 1-hour meeting with a man who checks his watch if you talk for more than 30 seconds without making a point. I knew right then that this was going to be a massacre. The opening slide featured a stock photo of diverse people high-fiving on top of a mountain with text that read, "Synergizing tomorrow's velocity today." I felt a migraine physically spawn behind my left eye. I tried to explain that this client is a data person who wants specific information about specific problems. The VP dismissed me completely. He said I was too focused on minor details and didn't understand that this was a strategy review. He said we needed to sell a vision. Then he showed me a slide with an unlabeled graph where the line just went up. He called it emotional resonance. I called it meaningless garbage, but only in my head. For 3 hours, I watched him systematically destroy every piece of useful information I'd prepared. Every time I tried to include actual operational data, he deleted it and called it too dense or too boring. He replaced my analysis of fuel cost fluctuations with a slide titled "The Journey to Wow" that featured a cartoon rocket ship. I am not exaggerating. A literal cartoon rocket ship on a presentation for a 70-year-old businessman who built his empire on trucking and warehousing. When I objected, the VP stopped and looked at me with barely concealed hostility. He said he was getting a lot of resistance from me and that he'd been told I was a team player. There it was. The team player trap. The moment you disagree with someone's terrible idea, you're labeled as difficult and resistant to change. I tried one more time. I told him I was trying to protect the relationship we'd spent 7 years building. He snapped back that I was trying to protect my turf and that I'd been gatekeeping this client for years. He said maybe the account was stale because I'd been coasting. Coasting. I thought about the Christmas morning I spent on a conference call with customs agents. I thought about the time I personally flew across the country to deliver a replacement part because the regular shipping was delayed. I thought about the hundreds of nights I'd stayed up late fixing problems this client never even knew existed. Coasting. Then the VP made his final move. He told me I wouldn't be presenting at the meeting. He said he'd handle all the talking and I should just be there to take notes and answer technical questions if needed. He was demoting me in my own meeting. He was cutting me out of the relationship I'd built from scratch. A younger version of myself would have fought back. I would have gone to the CEO. I would have made a scene. But instead, I felt something shift inside me. It was the shift from employee to architect of destruction. I looked at this VP with his empty confidence and complete lack of respect, and I made a decision. If he wanted to drive the car off a cliff, I was going to let him. I was just going to make sure every moment was recorded in high definition. I agreed to everything. I told him he was the VP, and if this was the direction he wanted to take, I would support him completely. He looked surprised because he'd been expecting a fight. I closed my notebook and told him I'd just sit in the meeting and let him do all the talking. He actually clapped his hands together and said we were going to crush this presentation. As I walked back to my office, my hands were shaking, but not from fear. They were shaking from the effort of holding back rage. I sat at my desk and started documenting everything. Every instruction he'd given me. Every concern I'd raised that he'd dismissed. Every decision he'd made against my professional advice. I was building a paper trail that would prove I'd tried to prevent the disaster. The meeting was scheduled for Friday morning, and I spent the time leading up to it in complete silence. I didn't try to fix his presentation. I didn't try to warn the CEO. I didn't try to save anyone from what was coming. I just did my regular work and waited. There's a strange calm that comes over you when you realize you have nothing left to lose. The VP thought he was sidelining me, but he was actually setting me free. He thought he was taking control, but he was actually handing me the keys to his own destruction. All I had to do was step back and let him prove to everyone exactly how incompetent he really was. The morning of the meeting arrived. The boardroom had a spectacular view of the entire city, but the VP had drawn all the blinds because he wanted dramatic lighting for his projector. My client arrived exactly 2 minutes before the scheduled start time, which was typical for him. He's a man who commands respect simply by existing. He wore an expensive suit and carried nothing but a single pen. No laptop, no phone, no notes. He shook my hand firmly and we exchanged pleasantries. It was the only moment of normalcy before everything went completely sideways. The VP swooped in immediately, introducing himself with excessive enthusiasm. He called my client a disruptive force in the industry. My client repeated the word back slowly, like he was tasting something bitter. He said he doesn't disrupt anything. He delivers gravel and logistics. That should have been the VP's first warning that this wasn't going to go the way he planned, but he was too pumped up on his own confidence to notice. He dimmed the lights even further and started his presentation with that ridiculous opening slide about synergizing tomorrow's velocity. I heard my client inhale slowly through his nose, which is his tell for being profoundly irritated. The VP launched into a speech about vertical integration of ideation and blue sky thinking. He paced around the room making sweeping gestures like he was performing on stage. I watched my client. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at his hands folded on the table, completely still. About 10 minutes in, the VP showed the rocket ship slide and started talking about taking logistics into the stratosphere. My client raised his hand just 2 inches off the table. The room went completely silent. The VP asked if there was a question, clearly excited about the opportunity to showcase his knowledge. My client asked where the third quarter operational report was. The VP blinked. He said we were looking forward, not backward, and that the old numbers were in the appendix somewhere. My client said he'd lost 2 shipments at a European port the previous week and wanted to know exactly why it happened. He wanted specific data on fuel cost variances. He wanted to know why a system integration had failed multiple times. These were real questions about real problems. The VP froze. He didn't know any of this information because he'd never bothered to read the briefing documents. He started stammering about technical hiccups and growing pains while sweat beaded on his forehead. My client turned away from the VP completely and asked me directly to explain what had happened. I opened my mouth to respond. I had all the information memorized. I knew exactly what had gone wrong and how I'd fixed it. But before I could say a single word, the VP physically stepped between me and the client. He literally blocked my line of sight and told my client that I didn't need to bore him with tiny details. Then he said the words that ended his career. He said I was support staff. After 7 years of late nights, missed holidays, and saving millions of dollars, he called me support staff in front of the client I'd built my entire reputation on. The temperature in the room dropped to absolute zero. My client stared at the VP with an expression of pure disbelief. I stood up slowly. The sound of my chair scraping against the floor was deafening in the silence. The VP turned and asked where I was going, annoyance clear in his voice. I told him that since I was just support staff, and he clearly had everything under control, I was excusing myself. I picked up my notebook and my pen. The VP's voice cracked as he ordered me to sit back down. I didn't turn around. I told him I wouldn't want to bore anyone with details, and then I walked out of the room. As the door closed behind me, I heard my client's voice for the first time, loud and clear and absolutely furious. He told the VP to sit down and turn on the lights. I walked down the hallway feeling lighter than I had in years. I didn't go back to my desk. I didn't pack my things. I walked straight to the elevator and left the building. My phone started buzzing before I even reached the subway station. Missed calls from the VP. Angry texts demanding I come back immediately. Messages from the CEO asking what was happening. I turned my phone to silent and went home. When I got to my apartment, I made coffee and changed into comfortable clothes. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and opened my personal laptop. I spent the next 6 hours creating a detailed document of everything that had happened. Every meeting, every decision made against my advice, every warning I'd given that was ignored. This wasn't a resignation letter. This was evidence. I wasn't planning to send it yet, but I wanted it ready for when I needed it. Around 4 in the afternoon, I turned my phone back on. It vibrated for 2 solid minutes with notifications. I listened to one voicemail from the VP where he tried to spin my walkout as emotional instability and begged me to come back and apologize. Then I got a text from a number I recognized immediately even though it wasn't saved in my contacts. It was my client. He said that was the most impressive presentation he'd ever seen. I smiled for the first time all day. He asked if I was legally restricted from working independently. I told him I was reviewing my non-compete agreement. He responded that soliciting means I would have to ask him for business, but the contract didn't say anything about him asking me. He was right. The legal language was very specific about me not being allowed to steal clients, but it said nothing about clients choosing to fire the company and hire me directly. My client told me to sit tight and let the VP sweat for a week. He said he was pausing all contract renewals immediately. I sat back and watched the chaos unfold from a distance. The VP sent increasingly desperate emails asking me about operational details he should have learned months ago. I didn't respond to any of them. I'd requested medical leave for stress, which was technically accurate since the VP was extremely stressful. For the next few days, I watched the company spiral from the safety of my apartment. The VP had actually implemented his plan to cut support hours, routing everything through an automated ticketing system. For a client moving perishable goods across 40 countries, this was catastrophic. The real disaster happened on Thursday. A junior analyst I'd been mentoring sent me a panicked message saying the VP had told them to ignore a priority flag on a shipment because he thought it was a system glitch. It wasn't a glitch. It was medical vaccines that had been sitting on an airport tarmac for 12 hours in improper temperature conditions. They were spoiling. I had a choice in that moment. I could intervene and save the shipment, proving my value, or I could let the VP own his mistake completely. But these were vaccines that people needed. I couldn't let them be destroyed just to prove a point. I quietly contacted someone I knew at the airport and told them to manually override the temperature controls and move the shipment to cold storage immediately. I saved the vaccines, but I also screenshot the entire conversation and added it to my documentation folder. The VP never even knew how close he'd come to a disaster that would have made international news. Back at the office, the CEO finally got involved. He sent the head of HR to call me and try to smooth things over. She spoke about corporate culture and family, calling my conflict with the VP a disagreement between cousins. She said the VP was willing to let me keep my title as long as I reported directly to him for daily task management. I asked her if the VP had mentioned the vaccine shipment. She had no idea what I was talking about. I told her to ask him about it and to ask why the client's legal team had just downloaded all our audit records from the past week. That part was a bluff, but I knew it would send the VP into a panic. Sure enough, 10 minutes later I got a system alert that someone had initiated a full data export of the client account. It was the VP trying to figure out what I knew or possibly trying to delete evidence of his incompetence. He didn't realize that the system logged every single export, including his. Then came the email I'd been waiting for. My client sent a message to the CEO and the VP, copying my personal email address. He said he was immediately suspending all new initiatives and conducting a formal review of service-level agreement violations. He specifically requested my presence at the upcoming company strategy summit. He wanted them to know I was still in the loop. He wanted them to know that he knew what had happened. The VP was finished. He just didn't know it yet. They asked me to come into the office on Monday to discuss a path forward. I dressed entirely in black with heels that clicked like gunshots on the floor. When I walked in, the entire atmosphere had changed. People stared at me like I was a ghost. I went straight to the CEO's office where the VP was pacing nervously. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. The CEO forced a smile and said they needed to reset everything. The VP jumped in saying they'd had a rocky start, but needed me back to smooth things over with the client. He actually asked me to lie and tell the client that the vaccine incident was a vendor error. I looked at both of them and pulled an envelope from my jacket pocket. I placed my resignation letter on the CEO's desk, effective in 2 weeks. The VP started yelling that I couldn't quit, that they had the big summit coming up. I told him I'd attend the summit as a courtesy to the client, but I'd be sitting in the audience watching him present. The CEO tried to negotiate with money and equity. I told him it wasn't about money. It was about the fact that they'd looked at 7 years of excellent work and called it support staff. The VP sneered and said I had nowhere to go, that I was too old for the market, that no one would hire a middle-aged logistics manager. There it was. All the ageism and misogyny spilling out in one ugly sentence. I smiled and told him that unlike him, I hadn't spent my career making enemies. I turned to leave and he threatened to make sure I never worked in the industry again. I paused at the door and told him that by next week, he wouldn't be working in the industry either. I walked out, packed the few personal items from my desk, and left. I gave a helpful contact number to the junior analyst who'd warned me about the vaccines. Then I went home and registered a new limited liability company. I didn't have any clients yet because I legally couldn't solicit them. But I knew something the VP didn't. I knew the client was coming to the summit not to renew the contract, but to execute a very public termination. The quarterly strategy summit was held at an expensive hotel with chandeliers and an open bar. I wore a red dress and took a seat near the back. I wasn't an employee anymore, just someone serving out a notice period. The VP was on stage doing a sound check, yelling at technicians about the bass levels on his entrance music. Yes, he had entrance music. The room filled with board members, investors, and key clients. Then the doors opened and my former client walked in with his entire executive team. The CFO, legal counsel, and CTO. They didn't sit at the tables in front. They stood at the back with arms crossed. The VP started his presentation with flashing lights and loud music. It was embarrassing to watch. He welcomed everyone to the future of logistics and specifically called out my former client, asking him to come sit in the front row. My client didn't move. He said he was fine where he was. The VP launched into his deck full of rocket ships and buzzwords. I watched my client watching the VP with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying an interesting specimen. Then the VP showed a slide claiming he'd saved 20% in operational costs by streamlining communications with my client's account. My client leaned over to CFO and whispered something. Then my client stepped forward into the light and interrupted the presentation. The VP tried to brush him off, saying they'd save questions for the end. My client said this wasn't a question. He walked down the center aisle as the room went completely silent. He stood at the bottom of the stage and asked about the graph showing efficiency savings. The VP beamed and said it was impressive work. My client explained that those savings came from firing the support staff who monitored his temperature-controlled shipments, which resulted in $400,000 of spoiled pharmaceuticals. The room gasped. Board members sat up straight. The VP tried to claim it was a glitch that got fixed. My client said it wasn't fixed by the company. It was fixed by me from a coffee shop while I was on medical leave. The entire room turned to look at me. My client announced that he didn't have a contract with a corporation. He had a contract with Competence, and Competence had left the building. He told the board of directors that he was invoking the immediate termination clause due to gross negligence. The CEO jumped up trying to negotiate, but my client said the legal papers had already been filed. Then he turned to me and asked if I was coming. I stood up, smoothed my red dress, picked up my purse, and said I thought I would. I walked down the aisle past the CEO, past the investors, past everyone who dismissed me as outdated. I met my client in the aisle and asked where we were going. He said we were going to lunch, and then we'd discuss my new consultancy because he had friends who were very unhappy with their current providers. We walked out of the ballroom together. Behind us, feedback from the microphone screeched and drowned out the VP's desperate attempts to salvage the situation. We went to an expensive steakhouse where my client ordered wine older than the VP. He toasted to disruption. I corrected him and toasted to competence instead. By the time our food arrived, my phone was exploding with messages. The junior analyst reported that the CEO was screaming and the VP was literally crying as security escorted him out. My client told me he'd take a retainer at the same rate the company had been charging him, but I'd keep all the overhead since I didn't have their bloated expenses. I did the math in my head and realized I'd make more in a month than I'd made in a year at the company. He also mentioned that 3 other CEOs who'd been in that room had just texted asking for my contact information. I told him to send it. Meanwhile, back at the hotel, the board held an emergency meeting. The stock dropped another 8% in the hour after my client walked out. The VP was fired before he even left the stage. They had security escort him out through the kitchen so investors wouldn't see him. Over the next 48 hours, the company lost 4 more major accounts. All of them called me directly. I didn't steal them or solicit them. They found me and asked if I could take them on. I told each one that my rates had gone up and I don't do PowerPoint presentations. I hired the junior analyst a week later, doubled his salary, and gave him a director title. I rented a small office in a brownstone with hardwood floors and real plants. The company tried to sue me for poaching clients, but my former client's lawyers responded with a letter that was essentially a legal version of "go away." The company dropped the lawsuit within 3 days because they knew what I had documented. They couldn't afford the discovery process. The VP tried to reach out on LinkedIn a month later, saying no hard feelings and asking if I wanted to help with his new cryptocurrency logistics startup. I didn't block him. I didn't respond. I just left him on read because that's what support staff does. We support, and when we stop supporting, everything collapses. 6 months later, my consultancy had 12 employees and handled $12 billion in contracts. We don't have a strategy VP. We have a coffee machine that actually works and a rule that no meeting lasts longer than 20 minutes. I bought the building we work in. I was sitting in my office looking out at the rain when I saw a news alert. The company was announcing a restructuring, selling their logistics division to private equity for a fraction of its former value. They were being dismantled and sold for parts. The brand equity the VP had talked about was worthless. The legacy relationships they'd dismissed as old-fashioned were the only things that had any value, and those had walked out in a red dress. I took a sip of my coffee and thought about how the VP had been right about one thing. The company did need to trim the fat. He just didn't realize he was the fat that needed trimming. Here's what I learned from all of this. In business, there's a huge difference between looking important and being important. There's a massive gap between talking about innovation and actually understanding how things work. The VP thought he was a disruptor bringing fresh ideas to a stale organization. What he actually was an incompetent manager who confused activity with achievement. He thought creating PowerPoint presentations and using buzzwords made him a leader. He didn't understand that real leadership is about building trust, delivering results, and respecting the people who do the actual work. The disease that killed that company wasn't me leaving. The disease was the belief that shiny new things are always better than things that actually work. It was the arrogance of thinking that people who've been doing something for years are outdated rather than experienced. It was the fundamental misunderstanding that in business, relationships matter more than contracts and competence matters more than charisma. The VP made the classic mistake of confusing the person holding the wrench with the wrench itself. He thought I was a replaceable tool. He didn't realize I was the mechanic keeping the entire machine running. There's a golden rule in any complex system, whether it's heating and cooling or global supply chains. You don't disrespect the person who actually knows how everything works. You don't dismiss years of expertise because you think you have better ideas. You don't call someone support staff when they're actually holding up the entire ceiling. And if you do make those mistakes, you'd better be prepared for what happens when that person stops holding things up and lets gravity take over. The funniest part of this entire story is that I didn't actually take revenge on anyone. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't steal clients or spread rumors or do anything unethical. All I did was stop protecting incompetent people from the consequences of their own decisions. I stopped fixing problems before they reached the client. I stopped working nights and weekends to cover for systemic failures. I stopped being the invisible safety net that made bad managers look good. The moment I stepped back, reality caught up with everyone. The VP destroyed himself. I just gave him the rope and watched him tie the knot. My phone rang while I was thinking about all this. It was my former client calling from Tokyo. He said the port was congested and they were warning him about a 3-day delay. I told him I'd already rerouted the shipment an hour ago to a different port with trucking arranged. He'd lose 4 hours instead of 3 days. There was a comfortable, expensive silence on the line. He told me I was worth every penny. I said I know, and I hung up. I looked at that documentation folder on my computer desktop, the one I'd labeled the exit all those months ago. I dragged it to the trash and emptied it. I didn't need insurance anymore. I was the insurance. I turned back to my work as rain washed the city clean outside my window. For the first time in 7 years, I didn't feel like I was holding up the sky. I was just flying through it, completely free. The company that dismissed me as outdated is gone. The VP who called me support staff is unemployed and unemployable. The clients who valued competence over corporate politics are thriving. And me? I'm running a multi-billion-dollar operation on my own terms, proving every single day that experience and expertise will always beat buzzwords and PowerPoint presentations. If you're watching this and you're dealing with your own version of that VP, here's my advice. Document everything. Know your value. Understand that sometimes the best way to win is to stop playing their game and start playing yours. Don't let anyone convince you that loyalty means accepting disrespect. Don't let anyone tell you that years of expertise make you outdated rather than invaluable. And most importantly, know when to step back and let incompetence reveal itself. You don't have to destroy people who don't respect you. You just have to stop saving them from themselves. The business world is full of people who think confidence is the same as competence. It's full of managers who believe that saying the right buzzwords is more important than delivering actual results. It's full of executives who prioritize looking innovative over being effective. But here's the secret they don't want you to know. All of that falls apart the moment someone who actually knows what they're doing decides to stop protecting them. The emperor has no clothes, but everyone pretends otherwise until someone finally points out the obvious truth. I spent 7 years making other people look good. I spent 7 years fixing problems in the middle of the night so clients never knew anything went wrong. I spent 7 years being the foundation while other people took credit for the building. And you know what? I'd do it all again because those 7 years taught me exactly how valuable I was. They taught me that my skills were worth far more than any salary a corporation would pay. They taught me that the relationships I'd built were assets I owned, not the company. Most importantly, they taught me that I didn't need them. They needed me. When that VP called me support staff in front of the most important client in the entire company, he thought he was putting me in my place. What he actually did was set me free from any obligation to protect him or the company from the consequences of his incompetence. He cut the strings, and I stopped being a puppet. I became a person who could make my own choices, and I chose to let him fail spectacularly and publicly. I chose to let the client see exactly what the company valued more than results. I chose to watch the whole thing burn and then build something better from the ashes. This story isn't really about revenge. It's about value and recognition and what happens when organizations forget that their success is built on people, not processes. It's about the danger of prioritizing style over substance and buzzwords over competence. It's about what happens when you dismiss expertise as outdated and replace experience with enthusiasm. The VP thought he was modernizing the company. What he actually did was destroy the only things holding it together. He thought I was the past. He didn't realize I was the present and the future, and without me, there was nothing. So here I am, running my own firm, working with clients who value what I bring to the table, making more money than I ever thought possible, and most importantly, doing it all on my own terms. No more late nights covering for other people's mistakes. No more biting my tongue in meetings while incompetent managers make terrible decisions. No more being invisible while other people take credit. I'm done being the foundation. Now I'm the entire building, and it's built exactly the way I want it. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. If you're in a situation where you're undervalued and disrespected, I hope this gives you the courage to know your worth. If you're a manager who thinks buzzwords and charisma can replace competence, I hope this serves as a warning about what happens when you push out the people who actually make things work. And if you're just someone who enjoys watching arrogance get destroyed by reality, I hope you enjoyed the show. The rain has stopped now. The city looks clean and new. My phone is quiet because my clients trust me to handle things before they even know there's a problem. My team is small but brilliant, and every single one of them knows they're valued. My office has real plants and natural light and no fluorescent bulbs humming overhead like a flat line. This is what success actually looks like when you stop letting other people define it for you. This is what happens when you step back from the edge and let the people who don't respect you fall over it without you. Life has its storms and its disasters. It has incompetent managers and toxic work environments and moments where you feel completely powerless. But it also has moments of clarity where you realize you've been holding all the power the entire time and just didn't know it. It has moments where you can choose to step back and watch everything you've been holding up come crashing down. It has moments where you can walk away from the fire and build something better. That's the real lesson here. You don't have to fight every battle. Sometimes the best thing you can do is step aside and let gravity do the work. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And remember, whether it's in business or in life, never underestimate the quiet person who actually knows how everything works. We're not outdated. We're not support staff. We're the difference between success and failure, and the moment we stop supporting you, you'll understand exactly how valuable we always were.